This music will hopefully set a tone on how Part 4 of The Secret of the Angel will end with a lonely private dedication in March of 1920. But before we can end this story in Council Bluffs, we need to end it back in New York. Dr. Walter K. Wilkins spent most of 3 months in jail after returning from fleeing to Baltimore. He did go to his home with a guard to presumably assist and supervise in the care of the 2 dog, Monkey, and Parrot with the neighbors. On Friday, June 27, he heard of his fate to be driven to Sing Sing the following Tuesday to die in the electric chair. Back then, the time on death row was seldom more than 3 or 4 weeks, except out in Rawlins, Wyoming, where the 1911 prison baseball team had death row players. In all, they played 4 games and motivatedly won them all. Each time they won, they were rewarded. Their best player, Joseph Seng, who was convicted of killing his supervisor at the Union Pacific Railroad for either firing him or interrupting an affair that Seng was having with his supervisor's wife, got to live 9 extra months. The old doc committed suicide Sunday afternoon little after 4:30 but did things before hanging himself. Just as the investigation and trial had been a national obsession, the doctor's suicide was also front-page news thanks to prosecutor Charlie Weeks, who had meaninglessly, at least from a legal standpoint, inserted the most famous celebrity woman in the country into the case. And up in Buffalo, the Courier bemoans that the old doc cheated the electric chair out of its fun. And as far away as Los Angeles, the Wilkins murder was front-page story. Not until June 12, 1994 was there a spousal murder with equivalent national publicity. Nicole Brown and an unfortunate waiter who was returning her eyeglasses that she had left at a restaurant table earlier in the evening were brutally stabbed multiple times by a physically fit assailant. Technically, O.J. Simpson and Nicole had been divorced 2 years earlier. A dream team of lawyers put the justice system on trial and played the race card and got their client off. 75 years earlier, the justice system put a doddering old man on trial and played manipulated evidence, lies, and publicity to get a conviction. In 1997, in a civil action lawsuit, the jury unanimously found O.J. Simpson guilty of both murders. The father of the waiter was awarded $33 million. O.J. Simpson moved to Florida and invested his assets in so-called personal property and paid almost nothing, due to Florida's personal property law. What really got played was the people's justice. There was none in either case. For now, let's see how Dr. Wilkins' life ended. After the verdict, the doctor had 3 visitors. His defense attorney Charlie Wissong visited Saturday and talked about an appeal. On Sunday, Walter had 2 visitors, Andrew Heberer, the chaplain of the Volunteer Fire Department of Hempstead, New York, and Reverend August Deppish, who was a minister, but at the time, he was working in private business. On Sunday, the doctor may have told Heberer and Deppish about the possible appeal. The old doctor was being himself to the end, telling people what would please them, and apparently did not speak of suicide. A lot of people were not convinced the doctor did it, and a women's group from the trial were determined to get better defense. Only 2 weeks after Reverend Deppish's visited the doctor, Deppish's business partner was killed by a nearly identical method of the killing of Julia Wilkins. Now back to the visit, either Heberer or Deppish gave the doctor a lead pencil. The doctor wrote 3 letters with the pencil. From the sheriff and district attorney and on down, this pencil was a significant irritation. Maybe they did not want him to speak from his cell. Freedom of speech is not so free when going against corrupt authority. The pencil was as bad as whoever gave him the rope to hang himself. 3 letters were found in the doctor's pocket by County Coroner Walter R. Jones. The coroner would not turn 2 of the letters over to Sheriff's Department or the district attorney as they demanded. He did release a summary of the 2 letters to the press, then forwarded the letters to the addressees. One letter was to Elizabeth Muller. Remember her, she was Julia's friend, a law schoolmate of Caroline Dodge, and the person who probably helped Julia to write the 1915 will. She was living in rural central New York. The doctor asked that she would adopt Julia's 4 pets. She accepted. In an interview, she strongly expressed her disagreement with the guilty verdict. Too bad Charlie Wisong, the lead defense attorney, did not use Elizabeth as a character witness. She knew Julia and Walter and was somewhat knowledgeable of the finances. She was also a lawyer, but maybe that would have been a problem. No women were on the jury, and it would not be until 1937 before women were allowed on juries in the state of New York. The doctor wrote to J.P. Healy, a friend and a retired newspaper person. It was a long letter, and the coroner released very little except that Walter claimed that he was framed with false evidence. In an interview with J.P. Healy, a former reporter, he expressed that Nassau County's record of enforcing the law against criminals was so poor they railroaded an innocent man into the electric chair to have a win. Last, Walter left a letter to Sheriff Seaman. He said he was taking his own life because he did not want to be driven to Sing Sing with Carmen Plant, who produced the phony evidence, and he would relieve Judge Manning of the burden during sentencing, of claiming it was a fair trial. Last, he wanted his possessions to go for a proper burial. He had $54, a gold wedding ring, gold cufflinks, and a watch. To make a long story short, the county kept his dying possessions. Basically, it was finders keepers, losers weepers, when there were no heirs. Julia had provisions in the 1915 will for Walter to be buried with her when he died, but that was squashed. The old doc was headed for Potter's Field, as was Judas, after his suicide according to the Gospel of Matthew. Potter's Field is a field where the clay soil was poor for agricultural but good for making pottery. And as A+, back in Judas's day, the potters had already dug a bunch of holes, so throwing a body in one of the holes was easy. Last, one of the women of the Free Wilkins League of Women came forward, took the body, had it cremated, and gave it a proper burial. Now for the walk of shame for Nassau County. Plant, Barbuti, and Chadwick, who is Plant's son-in-law and who kept finding questionable evidence, did time in Sing Sing. Their buddy, Pettit, the old Long Beach police chief, not shown here, also did time. Sheriff Seaman was fired by the governor for poorly running the jail and skimming money off the top of the payroll budget. Somehow he stayed out of jail. It wasn't just Plant and Barbuti but many of the county officials. Nassau was the illicit entertainment hotspot for New York City, where gambling and prostitution was permitted as long as enough officials and law enforcement personnel were paid off. Not only was gambling and prostitution big in Nassau County, Carmen Plant was selling protection to auto thieves. Barbuti got 5 years for framing another lawman. Aubrey Petty, the former police chief of Long Beach, did do time, and so did the Lynbrooks chief, Lester Chadwick. Chadwick not only was closely tied to one brothel but was selling protection to other brothels. The doctor's suicide was a bonus publicity stage for many. Included was the governor of New York, who would toss his hat into the ring for a run at the presidency in 1920. District Attorney Charlie Weeks was ready to call a grand jury to get an indictment if he could find someone to indict and something to indict about. Both the coroner and sheriff announced investigations and hearing. The person that came under the most scrutiny was Sheriff Phineas Seaman. He fired 2 of the jailers and the warden, but that wasn't enough. 2 state bureaucrats came to town and investigated. They said the sheriff ran the jail like a kindergarten and was skimming money off the top of the payroll. One prisoner said you could get most anything you want, if you had the money, from a side business the sheriff's wife was running. Governor L. Smith, at the far limit of his authority, fired Sheriff Seamans and on October 29, and then put in Mr. Joseph E. Davis as a temporary sheriff. Mr. Davis was an elite of Long Island and knew the governor. The Wilkins murder had been a national obsession ever since Audrey Munson was inserted March 20. When the doctor committed suicide late Sunday afternoon, it was too late for the papers. On that Sunday, very few newspapers actually headlined the signing of Treaty of Versailles that took place the day before. For most, the official end to the Great War did not rate as page 1 material. The New York Sun did put it on page 1 but also found a way to tie it to Prohibition. Monday, 2 days after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles to eliminate war forever, the Brits and Irish were at it again. And still worthy of page 1, was news of the murder case that somehow involved Audrey Munson but didn't. The fallacious pitch to the nation was that the old doc killed his wife to buy favors from Miss Munson, then offed himself when caught. The star celebrity on the prosecution's side at the Wilkins murder trial was Mr. William J. Burns. We are talking about William John Burns, who was nominated by President Harding and became the director of the Bureau of Investigation before the Bureau became known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or simply the FBI. We are not talking about William Joseph Burns, who was nominated by President Biden and became the director of the CIA. William John Burns was involved in a scandal that would bring down President Harding near the end of his time in office. He died 29 months after being sworn in. Harding's other scandals were the result of being too likable. After his death, his infidelity began to surface. He was in a class with Jack Kennedy and Bill Clinton when it came to adultery while holding public office. In fact, he beat Wild Bill Clinton with a girl that was 1 year younger than Monica Lewinsky at the time of the beginning of their affair, and that resulted in a daughter. Besides his affair with Miss Britain at work, he had an affair back home in Ohio with married Mrs. Phillips. The scandal that hit while he was still alive was the oil scandal. To make a long story a little shorter and to bring out the role of William John Burns, the Navy had transitioned from the old coal-fired ships such as the Dreadnought class to oil-fuel-fired ships. With oil as a fuel, ships such as the USS Oklahoma, the United States' first oil-fired battleship, could build up steam faster, resulting in faster and/or bigger battleships. But instead of buying from established petroleum producers, it was believed that the needed oil could be produced more directly from oil reserves beneath government-owned land. By 1910, the conversion from coal to oil was the recognized future. Presidents Taft and Wilson consigned 3 oil fields on public land to the Navy. The Navy knows how to navy, but they did not know how to produce and refine crude oil. The Secretary of the Navy, Edwin Denby, got rid of managing the 3 fields and transferred them to the Department of the Interior, with President Harding signing an executive order May 31, 1921. The Department of the Interior under Albert Fall was just as clueless on producing oil, but the Department of the Interior controlled adjacent public lands that most likely was as oil-worthy as the Navy's fields. The Department of the Interior did not know how to produce oil for the Navy, but Ed Doheny and Harry Sinclair did, and especially if by some means, they got adjacent oil tracts to make the venture more profitable from a size standpoint to justify capital equipment investment. Doheny got the 2 California fields and Sinclair got the Teapot Dome in Wyoming. Both were in line to get nearby tracts. The Wall Street Journal broke the story in April of 1922 of the secret non-competitive leasing deals. The job to investigate the irregularities then fell into the hands of William John Burns. Burns was a celebrity sleuth in violent crimes such as bombing of the Los Angeles Times building, clearing Leo Frank of Mary Fagan's murder, and convicting old Doc Wilkins of killing his wife. But he was over his head in investigating the common practice of influence buying and peddling in Washington, D.C., and when it crosses the line to quid pro quo bribery. Albert Fall did go down for accepting bribery, doing 9 months in the New Mexico State Penitentiary, but maintaining it wasn't bribery but just a sweetheart loan from Doheny. In total, Fall received over $400,000 in 1922 money from Doheny and Sinclair. Doheny avoided jail time, but when the pressure of the second trial built in 1929, his son, Ned, shot and killed his very close friend Hugh Plunkett, then killed himself. Ned and Hugh had delivered gifts and money to Fall. With the death of President Harding in August of 1923, the new president Calvin Coolidge wanted to put the oil scandal behind him. The new Attorney General Harlan F. Stone asked Burns for his resignation, and Burns was replaced by a promising young lawman, J. Edgar Hoover, on May 10, 1924. The old Attorney General under Harding, Harry Dougherty, was on his way to being indicted for receiving a bribe from American Metals Corporation. With his resignation from the Bureau of Investigation, Burns must have thought the oil scandal was in the past, but it wasn't. One of Burns' lieutenants in his detective agency was hired by Harry Sinclair as Sinclair's trial got underway in 1927, with 13 of the agency's investigators assigned to the case. Burns at first claimed his agency was just ensuring the safety of the jurors. Then from Sinclair, the detective agency was supposedly passively investigating the jurors to better understand them. Some of the jurors said the investigation was not so passive. Burns eventually was convicted and sentenced to jail. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed the sentence before Burns did time in jail. After the trial and suicide, Long Beach partially returned to the lovely city by the sea, but with new vitality on the business side, even though the economy of much of the country was going into the toilet as the U.S. poured billions into Europe after the Great War. In Long Beach, fortunes were on the rise for many. One guess is that the Civil War baby boomers, that had done well in life, were ready to get out of the rat race in the city. By 1922, with a bigger budget, Chief Tracy had a staff of officers and men including a captain, 4 sergeants, and 20 patrolmen. He also imposed his morality on bathers on the beach by requiring 2-piece bathing suits, not the 1-piece worn by women of dubious character such as those members of the Philadelphia Mermaid Club. Also, the bathers of opposite sex could not lay closer than 6 inches on the beach. It probably was not a case of Tracy's morality but the community as a whole. From the previous picture, note the gray hairs and no hairs. These were Civil War baby boomers that had made it, but who still had one foot in the Victorian era. Remember William H. Reynolds from Part 3 of The Secret of the Angel, who said, "No burglars, sneak thieves or marauders would have the hardihood to invade Long Beach." Elatedly he saw the fortunes of Long Beach come back to life. For many ventures, Reynolds' timing was a problem, but due to his energy and questionable methods he succeeded. Besides Coney Island and the Long Beach estates, one of his other venture was the Lido Beach Links just east of Long Beach. The golf course cost Reynolds and other investors $800,000 in 1915 money and opened just as Woodrow Wilson got us into the war he said he wouldn't. Some 2 million cubic yards of sand was used from the dredging of Reynolds Channel. The course was universally considered among the world's best. Esteemed golf writer Bernard Darwin called the Lido the finest course in the world, and Claude Harmon, 1948 Masters champion and club professional at both Seminole and Winged Foot, one-upped him and called the Lido the greatest golf course ever. Tournaments and great player frequented the Lido. Gene the Squire Sarazen, Walter the Hague Hagen, Robert Bobby Jones, and Long Jim Barnes. Reynolds had a thing for towers, as shown here of the 1904 Dream Tower on Coney Island that burned down in 1911 and the Clock Tower at the Long Beach City Hall. Reynolds' most ambitious project since dredging and shoring up the island of Long Beach was in 1926 when he began work on what would become the second most iconic build in New York City. The site had been razed, an architect engineering firm hired, and a building designed and redesigned. But in the spring of 1928, leading up to the stock market disaster in October, money was tight and loose at the same time. Reynolds, reading the signs like an old-time weatherman watching a winter of extraordinary northern lights, knew that in the following months the weather would be anything but normal. Reynolds guessed correctly the financial world was not going to be normal. Reynolds sold the project for more than he had invested in it to Walter P. Chrysler. Chrysler had the architect add another floor so it would officially be the Chrysler Building. One project that Reynolds finished in 1929, maybe with profits from the sale of the building to Chrysler, was the Lido Club Hotel. For a golfer, staying at the hotel and playing the Lido Links was ultimate indulgence in life. If we go by the Long Island Railroad train conductor's testified timeline of seeing the Wilkins in the train station at 9:15, then there is no way the old doctor and Julia could have walked home that wintry night and then he beat her with 2 weapons, beat the dog, beat the parrot, and staged the house to look like 3 invaders were there. If we go by the conductor's railroad grade pocket watch when the railroads were the masters of time, then, the only conclusion is a good deal of the evidence was manipulated or manufactured by the local and county law enforcement people. What most likely convicted the doctor was his fleeing to Baltimore. He was hoping to see Elizabeth Lee Kirkland Shepard, a.k.a. Odette Tyler, in Washington, D.C. She was a friend and his second wife's daughter. She was a strong woman and would know what to do. But the purpose of the attempt to see her was irrelevant to the police. To them he was just running and then for some reason changed his mind. Also heavily contributing to his conviction was the 1915 will, with the torn-out testimonial page and his obvious lying hero story where Julia never enters the house but her purse and hat are on the floor of the entryway hall. The stupid old doc got himself convicted of a crime he didn't commit with his concocted story and with a great deal of help from crooked cops. So who really killed Julia? To the author there are 3 possibilities. From an opportunity standpoint, the 3 men that worked at the Army garage 2 blocks away. They had been working at the garage for 2 months. They did not show up for their shift Thursday night, the night of the killing, but did Friday, probably payday, and never came back. Maybe these were the 3 who were down by the hospital late that evening who ran when the provost guard approached them. From a motive and knowledge standpoint, it could have been a furnace man with partners. The furnace men knew the wealth of their employers and had keys to the homes. There were too many unusual sightings, equipment movement, and out-of-place cars and out-of-place people that happened that night to be called possible without an underlying cause. 12 days after Dr. Wilkins committed suicide, Friday, July 11, Gardner C. Hull was found dying in his fourth-floor office of the printing and stationery firm of Hull and Deppish in the late afternoon. The company was located in the financial district of Lower Manhattan on Fulton Street. The Deppish part of the firm was August Deppish, who had visited the old doctor 5 hours before he hung himself. Hull would die later at the hospital. He had 4 skull fractures among other head wounds caused by a hammer that was found at the scene. His brain was protruding and lacerated. The end-of-the-week payroll of $200 was taken. The murderers were the firm's 2 delivery boys, Edward O'Brien and Edward C. Page. Both were of slight build. O'Brien was 18 years old and Page 20 years old. The younger O'Brien was dominant. Both had been semi-abandoned, but that wasn't rare back in the day when a 16-year-old was expected to go out and make a living. Page had worked for Mr. Hull for 2 years and O'Brien 1. Page was described as mentally slow. At the time of Hull's murder, O'Brien was living in Jersey City, but both boys had ties to the Flatbush neighborhood in Brooklyn. As mentioned before, they worked in New York City's financial district. Flatbush is roughly 20 miles from Long Beach. We don't know if they ever went to Long Beach, but definitely the Army Hospital and hospitality businesses had need for products from Hull and Deppish. Also, Deppish was committed to ministerial work in Nassau County. After the crime, both of the boys fled by train. Edward Page was captured in Philadelphia and Edward O'Brien in Freehold, New Jersey. At first, O'Brien blamed Page but later admitted to beating Hull with the hammer that Page furnished. While in the Freehold jail, O'Brien confessed to killing Julia but later recanted. In New York, O'Brien confessed to other thefts, including stealing $50 from his aunt. Other newspapers described more violent crimes, and with Page being an accomplice. The stolen money from these robberies was used on clothing and playing games at the arcade. Grooming and dress was important back then. After the confession, and then the unconfession by Edward O'Brien of killing Julia Wilkins, defense attorney Samuel Whitehouse, who was Dr. Wilkins' second chair, and who was probably tied to Julia's family legally and politically, cited the method of killing, and that he and others would work to clear the old doctor's name. Wilkins' lead counsel Charles Wissong dismissed O'Brien's original confession as crazy youthful talk and said he may have heard of the Wilkins murder case from Reverend August Deppish, Hull's business partner who visited Walter Wilkins the day of his suicide. In December, the boys got 20 years to life. Page had undergone a lunacy evaluation but found fit to stand trial. Earlier, in September, Julia's niece and nephew got the 1915 will, with the testimonial page torn out, declared legal in probate court. Charles Weeks, the DA that convicted the old doctor, and Alan O. Myers, the private investigator, were at the probate hearing to maybe somehow prove the will was really real, or maybe more in their self-interest, to squash anything relating to the investigative irregularities in the case. The sentencing of Edward O'Brien, even though he was 17 years old when he committed some of his confessed crimes and 18 when he killed his employer, was probably just. Except for stealing from a relative, he only confessed to crimes where his friend Page also took part. Probably there were others that did not include Page, and O'Brien kept them secret. We really do not know about Edward Page. Several times his mental level was brought into question. Neither were sentenced to be executed. Maybe that was the court's leniency due to O'Brien's age and Page's mental capabilities. Clearly, the justice that happened in Nassau County in the Wilkins case was not justice. The Nassau County's injustice would have devastating effects on others besides Dr. Wilkins. In this case, and maybe as well as others, District Attorney Charles Weeks' regards for true evidence was arbitrary. All that needs to be done is to look at what he threw at the grand jury to get an indictment and put the old doctor in jail. Miss Audrey Munson suffered terribly. Her fame at the time of the Wilkins case was sliding a little. She had been the celebrity of celebrities for 4 years. She was an elderly 28 years old. She had been trying to find another life since the end of the Panama Pacific Exposition in 1915, when she was literally the model of 3/5 of all of the statuary at the fair. She may have been the most perfect 10 ever when the fair ended. She was then 24 years old. Her second movie, Purity, was a huge hit where it was not banned for nudity. Something wrong happened between her and Flying Ace Studios after William Randolph Hearst took over. Audrey left California for good. Back in New York, Audrey attempted to advance her other talents, but she was typecast as the nude model who began her career as the Three Graces at the Hotel Astor. Audrey tried Broadway, but maybe she was too famous to be repressively managed by the theater magnates. Stage actresses were a dime a dozen as the movies evolved. Audrey did work as a beauty consultant for the major department stores. Also, she quietly modeled for select sculpturers that kept her out of the headlines as she and Herman Ulrichs Jr. romanced. All the refined changes blew up in her face when District Attorney Charles Weeks announced to the national press that she was a person of interest in the Julia Wilkins murder case. Audrey may not have had a chance with Mommy's boy Herman Ulrich Jr., but maybe someone else in his elite crowd could have been a matrimonial match. The slander that accompanied the nationwide woman hunt for Audrey likened her to a prostitute. Any association with the respectful elite was over. From the time District Attorney Weeks brought up Audrey's name, there was no let-up. The author found newspaper articles in all but 4 states, but those states had minimal databases to search. Here are just a few clippings. Missouri, Utah, Texas, Alabama, Iowa, Nebraska, Indiana, Idaho, New Jersey, Arkansas, Kansas, California. When Audrey returned from Canada, the public had turned against her. In her own words, "The Wilkins case has ruined my life. The public used to love and admire me. Now all I find everywhere is hate." Audrey tried to find work in New York, Detroit, and Chicago. Seldom noted is that Audrey could play 3 instruments: sing, dance, and artistically paint. In Chicago she worked as a dance teacher, but nothing lasted. Nearly broke, she returned to Syracuse to be with her mother, Kitty. There she tried selling household items door to door with her mother. Here is a newspaper clipping from January 5, 1921. Audrey was upbeat and says she will be back but cannot reveal names and the activity. The project may have been the Heedless Moths. In the final cut, Jane Thomas played Audrey and Audrey got to be herself for the nude scene. Back in the day, the promotional tour was almost as lucrative for a star as the studio payment for acting. Audrey was excluded from the tour and sued for damages. Without work, she and Kitty returned to their rural hometown setting of Mexico, New York. After a publicized romance by telegraph and letters with a man from Ann Arbor, Michigan failed, Audrey became depressed, severely lost weight, and attempted suicide. Her mother found her and got her medical help. Audrey basically quit life. She was known as the crazy woman that roller skated 2 miles to town pushing a lawnmower for balance to get the mail. Audrey came across a farmer beating his draft horse and attacked him with a pitchfork. Here are 2 newspaper clippings on Audrey's attempted suicide on May 27, 1922. She took an overdose of medicine that contained mercury that was used back then to treat some form of venereal disease. Kitty in some way got the judge to drop the charges, and shortly thereafter, on Audrey's 40th birthday. In 1931, her mother committed her to St. Lawrence State Hospital, in Ogdensburg, New York. It was primarily an insane asylum, and its former name so stated the words. Here the suicide attempt 9 years prior was sufficient proof enough she was insane. Audrey's father, Edgar, visited a few times up until the late 1930s or early 1940s, but it was not a family reunion. His hatred for Kitty was evident in a poem he wrote believing Audrey had made millions and Kitty had squandered it. Kitty moved from Mexico, New York to Oswego, New York, and worked at Coon Nursing Home. For 5 years Kitty visited and apparently hoped Audrey could be released, but Kitty would not have been capable to support Audrey on the outside. In October of 1939, Kitty, at 75 years old, made her last visit to see Audrey. After the early 1940s, Audrey may have not had any visitors until the 1980s. Audrey's diagnosis was mental blight. Basically some degree of depression with no known treatment. Audrey's records were, and are sealed. One staff member at the hospital read them and told James Bone, author of The Curse of Beauty, the 2 most dramatic events suffered by Audrey was the Wilkins murder and the annulment of her marriage to Herman Ulrichs Jr. They may have not been married, but Kitty said they were, and so stated her daughter's name on a census as Mrs. Audrey M. Ulrichs. For the rest of 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the once most popular woman in North America, if not the world, had no visitors. In the 1980s, Audrey niece on her father's side, Darlene, after hearing scraps of comments for years, found out she had an aunt that was in the state asylum up in Ogdensburg. Darlene visited, and after a telephone exchange met Audrey in person. Darlene lived about 200 miles from Ogdensburg but did visit and once brought Audrey's half-brother, Hal. Audrey died 4 months short of her 105th birthday. She was cremated. She had been going fairly strong almost to the end when the state of New York decided to change the hospital system and Audrey would have to leave St. Lawrence. As Audrey was the only child of Kitty and Edgar, there was no direct family left and she had outlived any associates in her 64 years in the asylum hospital. Her father Edgar and Kitty divorced when Audrey was 8. He died in 1945 and was buried in the New Haven, New York cemetery. Audrey's ashes were buried adjacent to her father's grave. For 20 years Audrey's grave was unmarked. In 1916 the people of New Haven, including out-of-town nieces and nephews, celebrated Audrey's life. In this picture, the author believes the two ladies in the front row left side are Audrey's nieces Hallett and Darlene. Also one of the ladies, Jennifer, made the cake. 2 ladies, Marie and Deborah, were primarily responsible for the headstone that modestly reads, actress and model. Audrey Munson. June 8, 1891. February 20, 1996. The baby angel for the woman who was the model of the Council Bluffs angel is appropriate. Before leaving Miss Munson and proceeding to what happened to the angel in Council Bluffs, it is worth noting the depth of emotion Audrey could have, and especially for animals. In one parade in Syracuse they had for her, she held 2 small dogs. In the parade she was in a chauffeured top-down touring car. This may have been the first parade in this country to specifically honor a woman. She liked cats also. At the hospital she had a stuffed kitten that was prohibited, but the staff let her have it because she really was not that insane. In her modeling and acting life, Audrey must have gone through Council Bluffs, Omaha many times via the railroad. It is very likely she knew she had modeled for a statue in Council Bluffs. In the hours of holding a pose, both Audrey and Daniel French were conversant on many subjects. At some time, and maybe multiple times, the subject what and who she posing for would have come up. French probably said that it was for an angel that would commemorate the wife of General Grenville Dodge. The general and French were well acquainted. When the general, as president of the Society of the Army of the Tennessee, wanted to build a memorial to General Grant, there was a contest of sculptors and architect to design the monument. Daniel French was the president of the National Sculptures Society that was to decide the winner of the contest. French decided a winner and General Dodge rejected it. Dodge went ahead with the design of Henry Schrady, sculptor, and Edward Casey, architecture. Dodge's decision was supported by William Hepburn of Clarinda, Iowa, who fought at the Battle of Island No. 10, the Siege of Corinth, the Battle of Iuka, and the Battle of Collierville. The latter 3 having General Grant in the chain of command. Hepburn was the chairman of the House of Ways and Means, in other words he was Mr. Money. The Grant Memorial had its share of Washington, D.C. subversion and backstabbing, but Dodge kept it on track until his death. And by that time the cavalry section of the memorial was done and the other 2 sections underway. The Grant Memorial was dedicated April 27, 1922, on what would have been General Grant's 100th birthday. Also dedicated 33 days later at the opposite end of the Washington Mall was the Lincoln Memorial by French and Bacon. In Council Bluffs, as the winter of 1918-1919 wound down, the angel was ready to be dedicated. The last of the construction and landscaping had been done in October of 1918. The contract with French and Bacon completed and closed. In Council Bluffs, Ella and Frank, her husband, were attending to the details, and presumably was working on the Iowa, Nebraska list of guests and a few relatives on Ruth Ann's family side that lived in Illinois, Missouri, and Texas. Annie was working on the East Coast list. She, her mother, and her father the general, had lived in New York City since 1881. The general moved back to Council Bluffs in 1907. The general had been well connected. He was the VP of Washington National Bank, had been the Grand Marshal of the dedication of the Ulysses S. Grant Mausoleum, and the primary money man. He was the Grand Marshal of William McKinley's first inaugural parade. He built, laid out, consulted, or had been on the board of directors of 16 railroads in 6 countries with enough trackage to circumnavigate the earth 3 times, and had been the shadow secretary of war twice when the political office holder was lacking. Ruth Ann had known 7 of the First Ladies. Edith Roosevelt and Nellie Taft were both alive and would have definitely been on the list. Daniel French had agreed to come to the dedication, and maybe Henry Bacon if he could leave the Lincoln Memorial for a while. Ella and Annie had paid for the best. Decoration Day 1919 in Council Bluffs was going to be the most grand private money memorial event ever, sponsored by 2 women. Little did the 2 know that happenings in Long Beach, New York on the night of February 27 would destroy the planned magnificent memorial to their mother. Back east, Ann Dodge and Daniel French were corresponding back and forth. In one of the letters, Daniel French draws likeness of artistic value between the Council Bluffs angel and his sculpture, Memory, that today is next to priceless in the American sector of the Metropolitan Art Museum. Ann Dodge's correspondence has been lost, but carbon copies of French's letters exist. French is advising Anne on having music and who should speak at the dedication. The second letter from French is dated March 3. There probably was a follow-up letter from Anne sometime in mid-March. After that, the communication between Anne and French goes dead for 5 years, and then a short thank you note from Anne. The author, and Danette Hines Snyder, the former historian and former acting executive director of the historic General Dodge House in Council Bluffs, have talked about Ann Dodge. Anne never worked, never married, never had a child. She lived solely off her parents and the trust fund that the general set up for the 3 daughters. The only job she had in her entire life, except for working the trust fund managers for more money, was the Ruth Ann Dodge Memorial Fountain. Simply put, there is no way in this world or the next that she would have blown off the grand dedication unless something terribly went wrong that would have been extremely humiliating. In her crowd of Victorian well-to-do women, something that would have caused her to be ridiculed and shunned to the extreme. It is most likely that Anne and Daniel French were aware of the Wilkins murder case on Long Beach but initially made little of it. The local newspapers had picked up on it and seemed to be competing on who could write the Paramount article. The Wilkins murder case was primarily local news. But a few days after the last 1919 correspondence between Anne and French, District Attorney Charles Weeks announced to the world that Audrey Munson, the model of models, the nude film star that been advertised as having the most perfect female body ever, needed to be questioned. Several newspapers, although probably touting their industry's make-believe ethics of journalism, invented that she was a witness, and then the contest to what Audrey may have witnessed began and her possible involvement. Of course, the chit-chat, gossip, slander made it worse, whether it was the ladies over tea or the men over beer. The men knew who Audrey Munson was and her body in detail. Audrey was the celebrity. People knew Audrey's face better than they knew the mayor of New York City, old what's-his-face who looked like Teddy Roosevelt. Back in Council Bluffs, Ella may have had additional awareness of the Wilkins' murder. Remember Elizabeth Muller, who probably wrote the 1915 will, who adopted Julia Wilkins' pets as a result of the letter the doctor wrote the day of his suicide. She was a law school companion of Caroline Dodge. There were only 4 or 6 women in the school depending on the timeline criteria. Caroline was Anne and Ella's niece and lived a block north of Dodge Mansion, practicing law in Council Bluffs. There is no way to know what was communicated, but these were intelligent and capable ladies. Anne and Ella could not go through with the Decoration Day 1919 dedication. The face of the angel was the face of Audrey Munson. The body of the angel was the body of Audrey Munson that many had seen totally nude. And to Anne, Ella and many others, that Munson woman caused that man to beat his wife to death with a hammer. If Ella and Anne had gone through with the dedication on May 30th, just at the time the trial of the doctor who supposedly killed his wife was about to begin, someone in the news would have put 2 and 2 together, and realized the model for the angel sculpted by Daniel French to honor their mother, Ruth Ann Dodge, was Audrey Munson. As March of 1919 came to a close, whatever Anne and Ella had planned was called off. Maybe the 2 hoped everything would blow over in time, but it did not. When the doctor killed himself, the whole story was again on the front pages of nation's newspapers, and Miss Munson nude movies were re-released and her old ones remade and released. Audrey Munson imitators were going on stage and stripping done to nothing at theaters, charging 15 cents for an arousing hour matinee. The months of 1919 rolled by with as little attention as possible paid to the angel. Finally, in March of 1920, Anne and Ella privately dedicated the Ruth Ann Dodge Memorial Fountain. The newspapers were not informed, and presumably the close family attended, and maybe 1 or 2 others and their wives. If the author were to guess, they could have been Attorney Stewart Tinley and Reverend Jacob Perkins of the First Congregational Church of Council Bluffs, who wrote the book, Trails, Rails, and War, The Life of General G.M. Dodge. The author is aware of the resemblance of Audrey Marie and Ruth Ann at about the same age. Both were very beautiful women and are forever joined by the beautiful Council Bluffs angel. Now you know the secret that has been kept for over 100 years.
Hello, this is Bob Swasina, the author and producer of The Secret of the Angel. I ended Secret of the Angel with an old American folk song, O Shenandoah. Shenandoah was a chief of the Oneida people of the Iroquois. He fought alongside the Americans against the British in the Revolutionary War and supplied food to George Washington's army at Valley Forge. Washington is believed to have named the river in western Virginia after the chief. But before, in the 1740s, a French voyager fell in love with Chief Shenandoah's daughter. The voyager's calling was west to the wide Missouri to trade and trap for furs. For 7 years, he and companions worked the Missouri. Then he went back east. What could have been between him and the chief's daughter was not to be, due to a war that pitted the French against the colonists and the Iroquois. The whole story of The Secret of the Angel is a story of what could have been, but was not, due to outside influences, starting with Dr. Walter Wilkins, then Audrey Munson, then Ella and Ann, then the historical recognition of Ruth Ann Dodge that should have been, and finally to a beautiful statue by Daniel Chester French that was completed at the height of his career while doing memory in Abraham Lincoln. The Council Bluffs Angel, with minor artistic recognition, has looked out over the wide Missouri for over a century.